Hello, everyone. Democracies haven't been doing their homework for quite a while. Actually, they started without doing fully their homework. When the process, the narratives of constitutionalism started in the 15th century, they constituted a U-turn in the narrative of power legitimation. So for autocracies to have the good city, the good state, it was very much about citizens being morally good. So that meant that citizens of a state would first have obligations, and out of those obligations they would have some rights. And constitutionalism just offered the opposite idea. The reason why a leviathan, a monster of power, the state, should be erected was to guarantee that everyone first has a fundamental right, and that those fundamental rights are protected. And out of those rights, there were some obligations that came with it. But that, as you can see, is a narrative 180 degrees turn. But the legitimation didn't finish there. The narrative was guaranteeing human rights, fundamental, well, not human rights, but guaranteeing rights to the citizens would legitimate what a state is meant to do, which would be having a monopoly of power to make sure that people cooperate with each other. So the whole trade-off of giving all your rights, all your liberties to a state in order to make sure that your fundamental rights are being warranted had a purpose. It was not the purpose itself. But in the narrative of constitutionalism, we sort of forgot that part of we're doing this to create a cooperative society. And suddenly granting human rights, granting individual rights was the objective of democracies. And with that, what happened is that the whole normativity of our democratic societies, of our Western ethics, are based on what is called methodological individualism. And that means that we see societies and we address societies on a normative perspective from the individual standpoint, both in the law system and also in the ethical system. And at the same time, when we look at algorithms and when we look at algorithmic systems, what we have is a real challenge to democracies, because algorithmic systems do not understand individuals. They are not about individuals. They are about, or they require, in other words, standardization. And standardization is about average. Standardization is not about the individual perspective and particularity of individuals. It's about creating fine granular collectives and categories to make a very structured and standardized process through technological means. And with that, what that means is that when we automatize through algorithmic systems, we're not trying to personalize in terms of individualization. We're personalizing in terms of structural identification of the variety and the plurality in a society. And depending on how you optimize those systems, you might create plurality or you may not. But the thing is that since algorithmic systems are being programmed by individuals, and those individuals are translating translating social problems, social processes into socio-technical systems. And with that, introducing their own assumptions of the world, their own biases, their own social ideas through the mathematization of all they have been taught in the society they've been raised and educated. Because of that, we think that those systems have and bear an individual perspective and have an individual impact. So when we talk about algorithmic systems, we demand that those systems should be focusing and should be warranting human rights, which seems fair, right? But that is an individual level. That's an individual methodology, and that doesn't catch quite up what those systems are doing. It's, in a way, like trying to regulate the forest by concentrating on each individual tree, although we know that forest is more than the sum of its trees. And the same applies to societies. Societies are more than the sum of individual wishes and rights. It's more than that. There is a collective dimension to societies that needs to be balanced with the individual dimension of the citizens, the rights of the citizens, and the needs of the citizens. It's not an either-or, but those two dimensions need to be acknowledged in societies because societies have different perspectives and different levels within its structure. And when we talk about human rights, trying to address and understand and create criteria to evaluate how those systems are working, what we're doing is, like we would say in Spanish, we're confusing speed with ham. Speed is something different to ham, which is a food. And we cannot regulate them in the same way. If you try to regulate ham quality by using the speed regulation rules that we have, you're going to miss the point. But we do have some instruments here in our societies when it comes to understanding that collective perspective. It's not well developed. It's something that people like Philippa Foot, for instance, was addressing when she presented her trolley dilemma. The trolley dilemma, you probably have heard about that. It's the situation of having a railroad, two railroads, and there's one person that needs to decide through which railroad the train needs to go. And in one railroad, you see one person in the middle of the railroad, and in the other railroad, you have four people. And you need to decide. And you can variate that dilemma by having two criminals and two old people with cancer, and the other, a very young person. It's a dilemma. It's difficult to give an answer there. But that is the whole conversation we've been having when it comes to autonomous cars. Who should the autonomous car kill? Who is it? It's the cat? It's the old woman? Who should it be? And ironically, when Philippa Foot presented this dilemma, it was not about understanding who to kill. Because that's the point of a dilemma. You don't have an answer to that. The point that she was trying to make is that there are problems that cannot be addressed individually because they are more about structural answers. It's like climate change right now. We know that individual answers will not bring us further when it comes to addressing structural problems such as climate change. And the same goes for algorithmic questions, and the same goes for the dimensions of our hard infrastructure, building bridges, building highways, building the networks of electricity and water. And the same goes for our social infrastructure when it comes to deciding how should be the schools and the hospitals and many other social infrastructure placed in a city or in a state, because they decide about the access to fundamental services that we cannot buy ourselves as individuals, that need to be granted to us in a society in order to have a stable, cooperating society. And when we think about all of those things, we usually use other values. And even in Europe, we have specified those values to make sure that when we have competing infrastructure, that this competing infrastructure is coordinated by guiding values that address collective principles. And what are those? Those are enshrined in Germany in the so-called Raumordnungsgesetz. And in Europe, it's a very European thing. It's quite continental. It's called spatial planning. And when it comes to spatial planning, we certainly don't think on that perspective, but we think about plurality. We think about sustainability, so environment. We also think about stable structural processes of economy, culture, environment, security. We also think about social cohesion. And those are the criteria that need to be balanced when countries are about to create a highway, or when countries are about to create a network for electricity. And they have to be harmonized within the whole continent. This is something that we have adopted not only in the European Union region, but also in the Council of Europe region, which encompasses almost all the countries in this continent. And the interesting thing is that it puts in a different mindset, which is actually the mindset that has been lost for quite a while now. In the 70s, it was Habermas and Richard Sennett addressing that we're starting to bowl alone again, that we're starting to left the public space unaddressed. In the 80s, it was Philippa Foot addressing the methodological individualism of our societies. And in the 90s, it was Bernhard Schleng, for instance, or Dieter Grimm, very well-known legal scholars addressing the fact that we are not doing an effort to, on a normative level, on a legal level, protect also the fabrics of what brings us together as a society. So now we have algorithmic systems that are placed more and more in the middle of our society and are precisely addressing that homework that we still have to do. So I think right now it's a fantastic opportunity to precisely think about that. What are the values of what does social cohesion mean to us? What does plurality mean to us? How we bring plurality and social cohesion together? How can we create a sustainable society? I hope that those are interesting thoughts enough for you to look at the Raumordnungsgesetz. It's really interesting. It's not as abstract as it sounds, and it's a very good night lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk, Lorena. And now it's up to you. Who has a question? Question over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lizzie. I am jobless, bored, and looking for something to do. So that's why I'm here. And I just wanted to, so the kind of like disjunct between individuals and society and how we train AI to work on that. Do you think that this then kind of morally bans technology from making people-based decisions? So like who to hire and kind of any kind of decision based on an individual. Do you think that there's kind of like a disjunct there that AI then morally shouldn't be allowed to do that?
Thank you.
Well, I think those technologies do not make decisions. They execute decisions made in advance. So you have prefabricated decisions about the future. And I think that this is not necessarily, I mean, it's not necessarily bad to automatize for the sake of planification, because this is what we all do in complex societies. I mean, to a certain extent, bureaucracy, it's also a systematization for to create or to make possible isonomy, so the equality of all people before the law, because you create processes and you document. So it is not inherently bad to create standards, to create processes that document, because this is also the way that you can get redress. If it's not documented, there's no way to get redress. It's very difficult. So, so when we build those processes, we start building those processes already analogically. And that is what makes the difference between the systematism of democracies and perhaps the arbitrarity of a not democracy. Or this is the point that Max Weber was trying to make when he was making his clear his support of bureaucracy. And there is a bureaucratic dimension in that part of automatization processes. Those processes do not decide. Those processes can create, though, a specific path dependency if the people using those systems believe that the systems have a high authority. But the fact is that we don't know how much authority we give to those systems. We've seen it, for instance, in the Compass case. Compass was a software to predict the crime recidiveness of people searching for parole in Florida. And well, that software was quite biased because of the very biased historical database of Florida. I mean, the US is the country with most prisoners of the world, even though it's 20% of the population in the world is in the US, in jail. Although I think America is only constitutes 5% of the whole world population, so that it's mind-blowing. So you can imagine what that type of historical bias makes in this type of systems. And everyone was very concerned about this software. And the whole discussion among us, civil society and scholars, was about the inherent mathematical bias of this software. Just one woman that asked to me the most relevant question, and she was olympically ignored in this whole conversation. Angel Christine from Stanford University, she asked, but how many times do those judges say no to the software and reject the suggestion made? And that is, to me, one of the most relevant questions, because at the very end, it's all about that. So what type of design leads people to structurally be manipulated by this type of technology, or to what extent people are using the technology in a way so that they don't have to justify their own bias. Because she was able to show that some of the judges were very much able to say no to the suggestions made by the machine if that person would be, ironically, an Afro-American that should be granted parole. So, suddenly judges were very much able to say, to have a different opinion and to not be manipulated. So those are things that we still need to understand, where we don't have enough data, where we seem to, and what worries me is that we seem to create this new narrative about technology manipulating us, falling from the tree on us, and seeing it as the third person party coming from somewhere, but it's not. It's a cultural artifact, so it's a reflection from us. So even there, I think that just saying nothing that has been automatized should be. I think there's a few red lines, but it's way more complicated in that respect, because on one side, of course, when we automatize things, they have a big scale. So they do not affect an individual, but a whole collective. So if it comes to hiring people, it does not affect a woman, it affects the whole women collective. It's even more intersectional. So it's not only the women, but it's probably a more fine granular type of collective that is not even aware that they are a collective, because it's too intersectional. So I think that is also one point. And we will need to think about discrimination in a different way than just merely by thinking in categories of ethnicity and gender and things like that. We will need to think more about discrimination as a process, and the processes that... so with exception of a few things like the military, I would say it depends on how it's being done. in any case, there's not so many systems that are fully automatized. In many cases, what we have is just simply a suggestion to the persons that decide. And I think we need to start understanding what it means, a specific correlation, and what it means, a specific statistical value. And this is something that has to do more with our education, but also with governance mechanisms where we try to put this in context with other type of information that cannot be mathematized and should not be mathematized because it's unmathematizable, like feelings, like empathy. We're trying to do that, by the way. There's already software out there trying to mathematize your feelings to decide how high the probability is that you become violent when you're acting in the street. And that is one of the things where I would say, well, it's not possible to mathematize feelings.
Thank you very much, Lorena.